Howdy, folks. So today we're going to go ahead and talk a bit about how we're going to be able to measure essentially the metabolic output that we're doing whenever we're exercising. So first and foremost, notice that that lady is doing a great job of social distancing since she is locked in a room with just a treadmill, and then at least we do have airflow going in and out. Now, in reality, what we're looking at there is direct calorimetry, where you're going to really figure out how much energy you're breaking down, because it turns out we are not 100% efficient with breaking down our calories and only using that energy for work. A lot of that energy, notice in this example, it's 60%. You'll see other examples from the book that even say it's closer to 75% of the energy we release from metabolism is just released as heat. And that's okay, because it turns out we like to keep our body temperature around that 98.6 degrees, and we don't want to get too low. So when you put someone inside of a room like this, or it can be even a suit, we're going to be able to actually measure the changes in the ambient air that's being given off by the individual that's exercising. And from there, we're going to be able to do some math and break down and figure out how much energy that they're using. Now, there's also indirect calorimetry. And that's where we're going to be looking at the oxygen you're taking in and the carbon dioxide you're giving out, and then how much effectively we would have assumed that you would have used as far as energy. Now, it is pretty accurate, but obviously it does require you to go ahead and put the wonderful, happy little Bane mask or the mouthpiece in, and then do some type of testing, or just laying there for looking for more like a resting metabolic rate. So whenever you watch the VO2 Max Lab, you're going to see the example of us doing indirect calorimetry when that individual was kind enough to go walk hard to nowhere doing the Bruce Submax test. Now, if we know how much oxygen you're taking in, we've got an idea of, obviously, how much you've been trying to utilize for aerobic metabolism. Now, it literally is simply going to be measuring the air before it comes in and then after you exhale it. And since we've got a pretty good idea that the average area you're breathing is about 20.93% oxygen, and whatever it's then decreased to once you exhale it, well, if we know how much total air you breathed in during that time, so that's your ventilatory volume, then boom, we're going to be able to mathematically figure out how much oxygen you're consuming. Now, the opposite is, or the same is going to be true with carbon dioxide, only it's going to start at a much lower level, like I think it's 0.04% of ambient air, but hey, that's going up very slowly, but well, it's going up. And then if we know how much then you're exhaling on top, which is usually about 4% of the air you exhale is carbon dioxide, then you are going to have the same type of math function that we're going to do and figure out how much oxygen you're taking in. Now, when we look at the ratio of the oxygen you're taking in to the carbon dioxide you're giving out, we can actually get a pretty good idea of which macronutrients you happen to be utilizing more of for energy. So we're going to find that individuals, when they have what's known as a respiratory exchange ratio, so that means effectively we take the total volume of carbon dioxide, put that over the total volume of oxygen. If that level is 0.71, meaning we're taking in a lot more oxygen than we're giving off carbon dioxide, we're using mostly fat for fuel. Now, when we get up to a 1-to-1 ratio, so that's an RAR of 1, that's when we're on average using just aerobic glycolysis. The reason I say average is because some of your cells are still going to be using beta oxidation. Some of your cells are going to have switched over and started using anaerobic glycolysis, but on the average, we're using aerobic metabolism. So we have obviously a huge number, we're talking trillions of cells that make up our body, and so they're not all going to be using the exact same energy system at the same time, and that's a good thing. So we're going to use that respiratory ratio to give us an idea of how much energy you're using. Now, notice that I didn't bring up protein. Protein is going to burn at about an RAR of 0.85, so you can't really tell where you're at because there's going to be that mix where you're typically using just carbs and fat for fuel. And obviously, we're going to be somewhere between that 0.7 and 1. And we're going to find is that individuals are going to be influenced also by their most recent meal. So if you just had a really carb-heavy meal, your RAR is going to be closer to 1. If you had a really fat-heavy meal, it's going to be closer to 0.7. And then obviously, if you're just doing a mixed diet, so on and so forth. Now, when we're exercising, when we're at those super low intensities, we're going to be trending more towards fat metabolism. When we're at higher intensities, we're going to obviously aerobic carbohydrate metabolism. And then we're going even higher. Now we're talking about anaerobic metabolism of glycolysis and then using ATP-PCR. But that doesn't give out carbon dioxide at all, so who cares? No. But when you're looking at this, just keep in mind, guys, it's just solving for an energy problem. So how are we going to produce enough energy so we're going to be able to keep up the exercise intensity and level that we're looking to maintain our performance? Now, how much CO2 we're actually giving off is not necessarily the exact number of our production. Now, the reasoning for that is because we're going to see that carbon dioxide is going to dissociate into bicarbonate. And because of that, it's going to be definitely being moved, but it's also being buffered out to a certain amount. Also, if we're building new carbohydrates, that's like gluconeogenesis, that's where we're going to see that RER of actually even less than 0.7. So a metabolic rate is the rate of which we're using energy in order to maintain whatever we need to at that time. So our metabolic rate is going to go up when we're exercising, and it's going to be the lowest it's probably going to get when we're taking a nap or we're sleeping. So if we are going to look at an average person, that RER is going to be somewhere around 0.8, because we're trying to use more fats as fuel when we're rest than carbohydrates, just because we have such a limited amount of energy in there. You're going to be taking in about 0.3 liters of oxygen per minute. It's going to end up being at about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute, just because whether you're a massive human being or a small human being, we all need about the same amount of oxygenation of our tissues in order to keep them alive. And we're going to find that our at-rest metabolic rate is going to be around 2,000 kcals per day. Now, obviously, it's going to be higher if you're a bigger, more muscular individual, and it's going to be lower if you're a smaller, less muscular individual, because we're going to find greater amounts of tissue. Obviously, they're not necessarily going to have greater demands. It's just the same amount of tissue is going to have pretty much the same amount of demands, so it's going to scale upwards and downwards. Now, when we're talking about somebody at rest, we're going to have one concept, which is going to be very rare, which is going to be what's known as the basal metabolic rate. Now, this is how much energy you're using. If you're laying down, you're in a room that's the right temperature for you to where you're not hot or you're cold. So your body's pretty much relaxing. And this is after you haven't had anything to eat for 12 hours and you have been sleeping for 8 hours. So that's the whole perfect world. Now, this is trying to give us an idea of what's the bare minimum amount of energy that we're going to go ahead and need in order to maintain our performance. And a lot of it's going to be more related to that fat-free mass. So AKA, you can be a bigger individual, but if you don't have extra muscle mass, your caloric demands are actually not going to be that high. Now, we're also going to be influencing our caloric demands based upon our surface area. So a larger body naturally gives off, meaning like longer limbs, and otherwise it's going to give off more energy to the environment. So that's going to need more calories. Younger individuals tend to have greater lean mass, so they tend to use more calories. If you're in actually levels of or areas of high stress, or in situations of high stress, shall we say, you're going to utilize more calories. Individuals that have greater amounts of thyroid hormone are going to turn over this more quickly, as opposed to lower thyroid hormone, where they're not going to turn it over as fast. And then obviously your temperature. So if you're maintaining a higher body temperature, it actually does require more calories, and a lower body temperature is on the other side. Either way, we've got a lot of things that are going to influence how many calories we need to maintain our body mass. And that's before we throw in exercise. Now, what we're going to use more for going forward, talking this class, is going to be what's known as resting metabolic rate. Now, it has a lot in common with the basal metabolic rate, but it's not the same, because, well, it turns out now we're looking at just someone at rest, and then we're going to extrapolate based upon that for an entire day. We don't have a fasting component. We don't have a sleeping component. We're just trying to figure out what's going on there. Now, this is just the baseline calories of pretty much keeping someone alive in a nearly comatose state. We then have to add in everything else on top of it, which is going to be your total caloric demands thanks to exercise or just the normal daily activities. So now exercise, that can be obviously thousands of calories if we're doing something like training for a marathon or ultra marathon or things along those lines. Then we also have the thermic effect of food, which is going to be the energy you're going to turn over literally from just digesting food. And protein tends to have the highest thermic effect of food. And then we're going to have non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That's fidgeting, kind of moving around, tapping your toes, tapping your fingers. That actually does burn calories. And if you keep that up for literally hours upon hours every single day, you add it all together, it's going to end up with you having used a much greater amount of calories by the end of that day. So what we're going to find is, as you'd suspect, when we're going and exercising at higher intensities, we're going to use more calories. So we're going to find that we're turning over oxygen more. We're going to keep breathing, obviously, to maintain that exercise output, and we're going to burn more calories the longer we keep that up. Now, what we're going to find is when we get at real high power outputs, we're going to have our oxygen actually go and drift a little bit higher. And that's going to be because we're going to be tapping into those type 2 fibers, which turns out are not really good at aerobic metabolism, but they're going to still be doing their best, and we're still going to have to maintain. We're just answering a question, which is, what is the method we can do in order to keep up that work output? So if we keep that work output as high as it needs to be, we're going to have to match that with our aerobic component if we're going to maintain it, obviously, aerobically. So we're going to see that when we hold this at long periods of time, we're going to slowly get the total amount of oxygen to drift upwards, even if we're just maintaining that work output, and it's not technically maximum. And this can be due to ventilatory situations. So now you're breathing a little bit heavier, a little bit faster. Maybe we're seeing some changes in our hormonal production, so the epinephrine, the cortisol, all of the different catabolic hormones that help free up nutrients so that we're going to be able to maintain our energy requirements. That's going to cause that to slowly work up. So when we get to the point in which we literally are not able to use any more oxygen relative to our body mass or just in general, that's what's known as the VO2 max. So that is where you can go a little bit faster. Like we can always sprint a little bit harder, but you're not going to be able to maintain it because it turns out you don't have the aerobic capacity to do it. Now, this is one of probably the best indicator of your aerobic ability. So people with a higher VO2 max, because VO2 max is going to be milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. So it's relative to the body size. You can be a bigger individual and still have a high VO2 max, but the idea is no matter what, you're still moving that body of yours. So having a bigger body or a smaller body, it's all about how good you are relative to your body size. Now, it's not the best. We're going to get to what's known as a lactate threshold in a little bit, and we're going to find that we're going to be able to increase this for anywhere. You're going to get the greatest amount of returns on enhancing your VO2 max in typically the first 2 to 3 months of training. Now, you're still going to be able to get a higher performance. That's going to be usually due to changes in things like lactate threshold, changes in things like enhancing your efficiency in whatever exercise you're doing. But you're going to, at some point, kind of hit a point of definitely some diminishing returns. Now, it's pretty easy to see. Now, if we're going to do this then for just raw numbers, that's where we can do it, where we're just looking at that liters per minute, and that's me like putting someone on an exercise bike, putting them on elliptical, something where they're not actually having to bear their own body weight. But when we're looking at sports, that's when we're going to be looking at these normalized values and how it's going to be relative to the individual size. So this gives us that equivalent where we're looking from individuals at different age ranges. Now, we've got examples of untrained young men and women. I can definitely tell you straight up, guys, we've had we've had athletes from the cross-country team in our lab with the ladies scoring in the 60s and a couple of the guys actually in the 70s for VO2 max. So that is a heck of an aerobic battery. Now, we're going to find on average, your typical female is going to be lower than your typical male, and that's usually due to differences in fat-free mass, a little bit of hemoglobin because women are on a monthly phlebotomy or self-phlebotomy schedule, so to speak. If you caught the joke, great job. And at the same time, your typical female also has a greater amount of fat mass relative to body size, and that also is going to, work against aerobic performance. And I said on average, not like it goes that way for every single human being. Keep that in mind. So what we're going to find is most sports are not just strictly aerobic or anaerobic, but we have points where we have short bursts, and then we're going to go and recover. So whenever we do that burst, well, we're creating this oxygen debt, and we have to pay it off. And this was what gives us what's known as EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And that in turn is going to cause us to have to breathe a little bit heavier after we finish so we can pay off that debt, and then our breathing goes back to normal. And if you guys that have done a hard sprint or anything before in your life know exactly what that happens to be like. Now, with the lactate threshold, this is the point at which that our lactate production in our body is greater than our body's ability to clear it. And once that lactate is accumulating, the problem with it is not the lactate, guys. Remember, it's that proton, that hydrogen that comes with it. And as that accumulates, the pH drops in the tissues, drops in the bloodstream, gets to be really uncomfortable and get bad enough that you throw up, along with obviously causes the burning and a lot of other discomfort that you're going to naturally get or in that training session. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at that lactate threshold, the easiest way that I like to think of it is our lactate production would be the faucet on your sink, okay? Now, the lactate clearance is the drain of your sink. Now, what clears lactate is going to be all the slow twitch muscle fibers in your body. Could be the ones adjacent to those fast twitch fibers in the muscle that are doing it. Could be ones somewhere else, somewhere otherwise in the body. Your heart and your brain also can use lactate as fuel. And so obviously once it leaves the muscle, gets the bloodstream, you can pump to any of those locations. That's what clears it. Now your drain is effectively a fixed size. But what we can do is we can keep turning up our faucet because we keep turning up our effort, keep turning up our intensity. However, we obviously are only going to be able to make it so far before we effectively are now starting to have the faucet going at such a fast rate that it's not able to drain in time, and that's when we're going to start to get accumulation in that sink, and that's when you have that onset of blood lactate. So here's a better example graphically of that excess oxygen or post-EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Thank you. Where we can actually see how you're going to have that debt you're accruing in the initial stages of your exercise, and then whenever you finish, your body's going to take a little while to pay off all of those demands. And that's when we're capping off our phosphocreatine and ATP stores in the cells. We're clearing the rest of that lactate and getting it back into glycogen, and we're really replenishing all of our hemoglobin and myoglobin of oxygen while we're also clearing that carbon dioxide. So it takes a little bit of time. Now, it's like anything else that there's not really a good, perfect way to measure anaerobic capacity. We can do things like looking at the accumulated debt. You're going to see the Wingate lab, which will be a video of me riding a bike hard to nowhere. And that's another time where you're going to see someone doing a lot of anaerobic work. And then there's also the later lab you can see, which is what's known as a critical power test, which is seeing how much wattage someone can maintain aerobically when we're having them exercise at a much higher intensity. But the problem is, it turns out, unless you're a cyclist, the Wingate anaerobic test and the critical power test don't have the highest amount of specificity to what we're really looking at for things like basketball players that naturally play a sport that happen to be pretty lactic in nature, and making sure that they're going to go ahead and be able to, effectively clear that lactate so they're going to be able to recover and perform at a high level. Now, a really big factor in more high-skilled athletes is always going to be economy of effort. If both athletes had the exact same VO2 max, the exact same lactate threshold, the individual that happens to have the most efficient technique, so they use the least amount of calories to go at whatever velocity, they are going to be the one that's more successful because they don't have to burn as many calories to do the exact same work. So what we're going to find is the higher or the longer the race is, the higher your economy is naturally going to have to be, because we're trying to be as efficient as possible. And the better way to get better, is to practice. So as long as we're doing a lot of technique work, making sure that individuals have the most efficient technique for their body type, their body size, they are going to in turn utilize less calories, which will make them more efficient. Here's the problem with this. Notice I said the more you practice, the more efficient you get, the less calories you burn while you're doing it. So if you're trying to use this as a weight loss tool, it actually becomes less and less effective the longer you do it for. Not a big magnitude, just keep that in mind. But it is a little caveat to understand. So the other problem is as you get to be lighter, you don't have to use as many calories to cover the same amount of distance than you did before. Hence why aerobic training is a great modality, but you can get yourself into a situation of diminishing returns when you're trying to use that only as your way to try and lose weight. So what are we going to see in really high aerobic athletes or high level aerobic athletes? Well, first and foremost, we're going to see that they typically have a very high VO2 max. They're going to hit that lactate threshold at a very high percentage of their max. A normal person hits their lactate threshold at about 60% of their max, give or take. The most highly trained kids we've seen in our lab literally hit it over 90% of their max. Meaning, when you're right before you hit your lactate threshold, you hit your ventilatory threshold. And that's when you start breathing a little bit harder, a little bit faster, at a higher rate than you did before, just like kind of that lactate graph for the first slope and the second slope. When you're going to go ahead and hit that threshold, well, it turns out now you're going to go ahead and start breathing a lot faster to try to buffer that out. And so what happens there is those individuals are going to if you're like working with them, you're talking with them, they're gonna have a hard time talking. And you guys have probably had this happen to you before when you're playing a sport practicing. It's that point at which you go from where you can have a conversation to now you have to simply focus on what you're doing. Like you can't have a long conversation. You've got to get after it. And then obviously the more efficient we are, and then finally, the greater amount of type 1 fibers we have. Because it turns out a greater amount of type 1 fibers gives us a greater aerobic capacity in general, and it's going to allow us to be a lot more efficient, and we're not going to create as many metabolic byproducts, which make it much harder to keep up that performance. Speaking of which, let's talk about what happens, which is when we get fatigued. And this is when we're going to have a decline in performance or an inability to keep up the performance. It's really what it comes down to. And we can fix fatigue by giving ourselves rest. Now, it's actually pretty complex. You know, is our fatigue caused by the intensity of our exercise? Because the reason you're not able to do another rep if we put 100% of your max on the bar is very different than you're not able to do another rep at 25% of your max on the bar. So it's going to be dependent on our fiber type. It's going to be dependent on our training status. It's going to be dependent on our diet. If we're not doing enough carbohydrates and we're doing some really anaerobic glycolytic work, you're going to fall apart pretty quickly. So it really comes down to 4 different causes that can all work together to obviously get someone to bonk out. First is a lack of energy delivery or production, okay? Accumulation of too many metabolic byproducts. And that's going to be specifically when we're seeing that really big drop in pH. Failure of our muscle contractile mechanism, and this can be due to perhaps some of those changes in pH or a lack of ATP or a myriad of other issues. And then finally, altered neural control of the muscle contraction. Literally, we're not able to generate another action potential. We're in one of those kind of absolute refractory period type situations. So when we're talking about the phosphocreatine system, now this is going to be caused when we're doing really short-term high-intensity effort. So this would be if we had you guys just sprint as hard as you could. Your velocity is probably going to peak somewhere in the 40 to maybe, sure, some folks could be 30 yards, some folks could be all the way up at 50 or 60 yards in. But you're not going to be able to keep up that peak velocity for very long, and it's going to really start to taper down most likely, definitely before you even hit a 200-yard mark. That's simply because we have literally gone and depleted that phosphocreatine. So turns out we can try to help fix this by pacing. And at the same time, well, you're going to have the accumulation of phosphate, which can also potentially cause a decrement of performance. But either way, if you don't have the ATP, you're not going to be able to do it. Next is going to be glycogen depletion, because it turns out we only store so much of those carbs inside of our muscles and inside of our liver. So it's going to be related to the total amount we have, not necessarily the rate of it. So we can do anaerobic work that really depletes it rapidly, but as long as we got a big store to start, we'll be fine. But either way, at some point, you're going to hit a point of performance where you've really decimated your glycogen levels, and because of that, your performance is going to suffer. So if you look at the graphs on the right side, notice, guys, that we're going to see where individuals training for 3 hours are going to have that massive decrement in glycogen levels, and they're going to feel, obviously, like that training would have been far, far more high intensity and uncomfortable, because it turns out they're literally just burning through those fuels. Now, this is going to be very much so important in whatever fiber types we're tapping into. So if we're doing this mostly with type 1 fibers, yes, those are going to be the ones that are going to be used most for endurance work, but it's whatever we're tapping into first and most frequently that we're going to have depleted. So if you're doing a lot of sprint work with relatively short recoveries, we're going to be tapping into those type 2A and type 2X. And if we deplete the glycogen in those, well, we're still going to probably have some glycogen in our type 1 fibers, but we're not going to be able to keep up the same power output and much less the same velocity, because it's gone. We don't have the energy in the bank anymore to use. And so it's also going to obviously be specific to the muscle groups you're using. So you can go for a really long distance run and just completely decimate the glycogen levels that you're going to have inside of the muscles of your legs, but your arms are still relatively fine. And the opposite would be true if you went for a long swim. So we really need to make sure that we understand that it's not just the muscle glycogen of the muscle we're using. We're also going to deplete that liver glycogen, which is going to start to bring down that blood glucose. And when the blood glucose level starts to go down, now you're really starting to bonk out and feel tired. If any of you guys have ever tried to do like really long distance training, you've ever hit the wall in training or otherwise, that's a great example of depleted liver glycogen and muscle glycogen, which on the net is going to cause a massive decrement in performance. Now, what we're going to find is that whenever we're breaking down muscle glycogen, we are going to obviously be utilizing that to give ourselves energy when we're going through the citric acid cycle, also known as a Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Now, if we're out of glycogen, well, it turns out we're going to now start to use more muscle and just general overall body fatty acids. The problem with using free fatty acid metabolism is it's not able to keep up the intensity. We're only able to break down fat at about 2/3 the rate at which we can break down carbohydrates. So it's just simply a math problem. If you can only give yourself 2/3 of the previous amount of energy you're using, you're not going to be able to maintain the same speed, the same power, the same, you'll feel like you're giving more effort, but you're not going to be able to do as well as you were doing previously. And so we have these metabolic byproducts. We're going to have heat, thanks to all the energy we're turning over, which is going to increase our body temperature and get us into, possibly, depending on the weather outside, getting into some heat illness levels, heat cramps, exhaustion, or stroke. Now, remember, lactate is not a waste product, but it's a byproduct, and we use that as fuel. It's a 3-carbon sugar. It's going to be that wonderful proton that comes with it that really gives us trouble. So we're going to find that when we're at higher temperatures, we actually are going to utilize carbohydrates more as a fuel, which is going to deplete that glycogen even faster. So that's going to, it's going to give us issues with how long we're going to be able to last. We're going to find that if we have people exercising at lower temperatures, so notice this is about that 51 degrees, that's why cross-country teams tend to like that kind of cooler fall weather, even though they're in short shorts and they're racing singlet. But once they get moving, they're churning over so many calories, even though they're relatively small bodies, that it's going to be far more comfortable for them to go at that rate than what they've done before. And so that's why there's some studies where they try to pre-cool muscles specifically for aerobic style training, and so it's a longer duration, where you see an enhancement of performance. Now, that total amount of lactate that we have, it is going to take us a decent amount of time that we're going to take to recover, where we're going to get that pH to come back up. And until that pH is all the way back up, we are going to see a diminishment of performance. Now, we're not going to just literally destroy ourselves because our pH drops too low. The problem is the enzymes related to breaking down carbohydrates for fuel are not going to function correctly. And when we get to be at the lowest pH, about 6.4, we can't even cleave another glucose off of glycogen because that enzyme does not work. And since the enzymes aren't working, well, it turns out you literally can't produce the energy, so you're not going to be able to go ahead and keep that performance up. So remember, guys, lactate is not a problem. The problem is the proton that comes with it, aka hydrogen, and if we are not able to break down that lactate along with using that proton in an adjacent cell or somewhere else throughout the body through aerobic metabolism, that's when we have accumulation. That's when we're pouring our faucet at a way faster rate than it can drain out the bottom. And then we have literally a failure of the neuromuscular, or the neurology side of things, where literally we are perhaps not producing enough acetylcholine. And because of that, we're not going to be able to generate action potential. We're going to see perhaps some type of altered metabolism in the neuromuscular junction. We're going to see that the stimulus threshold is perhaps going to be increasing on muscles. And we're going to see that maybe even the resting membrane threshold is going lower. So now, since we're hyperpolarized, it's going to require that much more in order to cause actual calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it's going to bind to troponin and allow us to have a contraction. So it's definitely going to be a part of fatigue of our central nervous system now, but it's not fully understood. So what is probably happening is there's maybe some rate limiters in the body that naturally effectively is like a governor on the engine and starts to shut us down. And now we're getting into central fatigue hypothesis and peripheral fatigue, or central governor theorem, and where we obviously are going to have the discomfort from hard training. And then that's going to get to be higher and higher to a point at which we're eventually going to, all of us will have a breaking point. The question is, how far is that? If you're more well-trained, you can probably tolerate more, along with you can learn to pace yourself. So you're not going to run yourself into the point where you're starting to fall apart. And then from there, obviously the next time you go ahead and try that endeavor with that knowledge, you can hopefully do even better than you have before. So thanks for listening, guys. Any questions, comments, concerns, please go ahead and let me know. Make sure you're staying on top of things, and have a great day.